Hello, welcome to Fathoming Fish. I'm Joshua, and today I'd like to talk about tarot read intuitively and tarot read formally, and what that means and why I think there is a lot of untapped potential in reading using correspondences and traditional meanings, even if you're an intuitive reader. In the greater tarot community, there's kind of a divide that's been around for a very, very long time. It's not new by any means, but there are basically like two unofficial camps that tarot readers fall into. So the first camp is what I would call, and we'll call for the rest of this video, as formal readers, which are readers that are using traditional meanings as codified by various esoteric experts and pioneers, people like A.E. Waite, Aleister Crowley, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, but there are other modern ones as well. But the point of the matter is they're using other people's work to inform their interpretation of the cards. They're also using correspondences, such as zodiac assignments, alchemical attributions, and everything like that. Those complicated little symbols. Sometimes this is referred to as reading by the book, where you're using the meanings that you learned from somebody else. And that's one camp. The other camp is often self-identified as intuitive readers who eschew formal education to derive meaning from the cards based off of visually inspired messages that come from the card's imagery or from the card's emotional suggestions in the context of the reading that they're doing. So they don't use a meaning in as much as they interpret based off of the art and based off of the tone and everything like that. So personally, bear in mind this is my opinion, I feel like this divide is both artificial and completely unhelpful for a lot of reasons, actually. So for starters, I think we need to really try and deconstruct and to do away with this idea, this notion that traditional reading doesn't use intuition. When we call one group an intuitive reader, we're implying by some degree that another group is not reading intuitively, and that's not cool and that's not accurate. I believe that there may be a desire to kind of make an aside criticism at the type of reader who will cold read or read by rote, which is where they're relying more on memory than they are on forming interpretation. So they kind of have an idea of what cards mean based off of what they've read, and they regurgitate that. And so there may be a sideways desire to kind of distance yourself from that type of reader. And I think a lot of people have had, when we talk about our classic tarot horror stories where someone has had a bad experience with tarot, it's often been with that type of reader who's often a complete novice who bought their first deck and they're using the little white book to guide and instruct everything. They're treating it like, the rule of law there, and so that I think is a big part of why people kind of want to separate themselves maybe a little from that, because somebody had, a really pushy person in their life who kind of laid out the cards and told them what the book said and really didn't bother interpreting. And it may have been traumatic or irritating or whatever, and they don't like that. And I understand that people maybe want to distance themselves from that. And I get that too, in esoteric communities of all types, there's gatekeeping, and there's always going to be someone who wants to bring back the old school initiations for everything. And that's usually where something like that serves some asshole's ego. And so, yeah, I get that people are kind of trying to create a narrative and create a method for reading, an attitude about reading that takes power away from these people who want to try and bottleneck them through their validation processes. And that's fine, I get that. However, I don't think that is a reason to reframe the entire narrative of tarot and separate it into two different distinct processes, two different distinct approaches, because someone had a bad experience. And I think most readers are going to be using both approaches for the most part, whether they want to or not. I think you're simultaneously drawing on your education and your intuition, and you honestly don't have that much of a conscious choice about it. So you can't say that you're specifically an intuitive reader or specifically a formal reader, because you're going to use both techniques, and that's unavoidable. So I think it's glib to act like just because somebody had like a pushy college roommate who got her first tarot deck one, semester, and she, tower death deviled you and read it out of the book and wasn't compromising, yet a bad experience with it, that everybody who relies on text and relies on education as a major underpinning for their interpretive skill set is basically reading without intuition, that they're basically a tarot app. I think that's a straw interpretation of it, meant to sort of support and validate the people who are not wanting to participate in a certain approach. It's an anti-academic approach that I just am not a fan of. Our culture in general has a lot of anti-intellectualism baked into it, and this is another way that manifests. So that's why I'm like, not a fan here. But secondly, I think one of the bigger drawbacks, and the one I'd really like to talk about today, is how this divide and excuse me, little tiny bit of a cold possibly. I think though this divide encourages readers to forego cultivating a potentially powerful and reliable foundation for their practice because they're trying to avoid having to learn correspondences, or don't think that is necessary, or think it's all bullshit, frankly. And that leads me to my hot take on this today that you are here to see. So I think all the esoteric bullshit in a formal reading, so to speak, is actually really, really, really good for intuitive readers specifically. So let's look at some cards and talk about this. So tarot never fails to provide a metaphor, and it doesn't today. So we've actually got a pretty good one. So let's look at Empress. Focus here. And Emperor. What about them? All right. So intuitive reading is definitely more Empress. Intuitive reading is very artistic, creative, nurturing, organic, holistic, all that hippie BS that we all love, and we all love it. We know we love it. That's a major reason why we're a part of the tarot communities. Yeah, so that's what intuitive reading is like. It's very, very free and expressive and gentle. Meanwhile, formal reading is more Emperor. It is definitely a place with rules and traditions. There's a lot of structure and order that he brings to the table. He has some authority, and there are authorities in formal reading who determine the process that we use to interpret cards. And so these two are counterparts, however. So I think, though, in general, and I'm going to just offer some insight of my own, an opinion here. I feel like a lot of contemporary tarot readers have a very bad relationship with Big Daddy here. And I get it. I completely get it. There's a lot of personal and cultural and political reasons why Emperor may not be your cup of tea. And those are justifiable, and I'm not attacking or criticizing that. However, in full spirit of as above, so below, I think that poor relationship manifests in a lot of ways, and this divide is actually one of those manifestations on a personal and cultural level with tarot readers and with these sort of esoteric communities that surround them. So there's been a lot of talk from other tarot luminaries who are better equipped to reach you than me about why Empress's energy is so important to Emperor's energy in this metaphor, or in this case, why adding intuition to your formal reading will deepen it and strengthen it. But I think a lot of people want to be all Empress and no Emperor. And I think we've talked a lot about what Empress brings to Emperor, and those are all valid and they're all true, and I do not disagree with them a damn bit. I think you absolutely need to bring intuition into your formal style of reading in order to make it personal and make it relatable. But I think that's an opinion that we kind of get, don't we? Like, we've heard it from so many places, we can kind of take it for granted. It's not a hot take. It's actually kind of the culturally common opinion. It's something we generally accept as a necessary part of growing with tarot, is learning to hone our intuition. So we're not going to talk about what Empress is bringing to Emperor, but I do want to talk about what Emperor can bring to Empress. And I think that we don't talk a lot about that, and I think we don't really have a narrative of that. But it's a really, really important narrative, and I think it's really true. So I think that Empress here can generate so many ideas. She births so many things, and so many ideas, so many notions, so many visuals, so much can come from her. But without structure, it just kind of goes everywhere, right? It's a little aimless, a little guessy even at times. It's vague. It's sort of non-committal and even a little superficial at times when we don't have something to underpin it and to frame it and construct it for us in a useful way. And I think that oftentimes intuitive readers will hit blocks where they're having a real difficult time unless they've really had the practice and they've been reading just with that style exclusively for a certain clientele for a long time. They hit walls. And they oftentimes don't really need the tarot. It's more being used kind of like an oracle. And this is, again, my opinion. Oracle, I love oracle decks. They're great. But just use an oracle deck if you want to use tarot as an oracle deck. You don't really need tarot to be tarot. And that's a fine way to use tarot. But you're missing out, is my point. You're missing out on a lot. So I think Emperor's energy here is at all its formal structures and all its systems of symbols and symbolic language and all those tomes of information and theory can actually make Empress a lot stronger and a lot more plentiful and abundant in the answers and resources she generates. I think the Emperor helps the Empress a lot. The Empress can create more when the Emperor is there to provide for her. Now, don't at me. That's not a gender dissertation. I'm not talking about gender roles. Tarot is not always about gender. It's just their natures and how they contribute to each other. An artist does better when she has a patron to help fund her art. It's just kind of how things work. Structure and restriction breed creativity. This was a lesson I learned personally firsthand as a teenager in music theory when my compositions were I was trying to break too many rules to be creative and different. I was trying to employ all my little tricks and flavors and ideas all in one work, and it just was a mess. Yes, I was very expressive. Yes, I was able to create things that were pleasing to me and pleasing to people that were very similar to me, but I wasn't creating good compositions that were accessible and pleasing to everyone, because I wasn't following the rules enough. It's not about following all the rules. It's about following enough of the rules to keep you contained. So I think that in general, many intuitive readers will start forming stronger messages when they bring in that formal, and I'm going to put the cards down here, that formal underpinning to their practice. I think that there's an infrastructure there that correspondence builds that can help really create a place to hang some of these ideas on. So, when I look at the Empress, and I'm going to switch up to a different Empress here. When I look at this Empress, my favorite Empress is the previous deck, by the way, that we had out was the Seventh Sphere Tarot de Marseille. This is The Spirit Within by Stephen Bright. And I will provide links to both of those in the description underneath. But so when I look at this Empress, intuitively, I see a woman who's content. I see a woman who is nurturing. I see my mother. I see a woman who's honoring her environment and is honored by it for that. I see a story here just off the top of my head intuitively. It's a single mother who is sitting down and she's exhausted from working to create something for her family, and she takes a moment to breathe in and be present, and she realizes that she's actually done quite a bit with very little, and there's a sense of gratitude within her, and there's a sense and a need for her to be present and be grateful for what she has in this moment and what she's created, and there's a sense of acknowledging her own inner power, her own Empress energy in this. Now, that's an intuitive interpretation of this card, and I get that from just looking at it and things like that and letting what comes to my head and what my imagination, my intuition co-conspire to create come forward. But I'm also able to do that because I can see the assignment of Taurus and its love of simple pleasures, and I can see Venus and its connection to home and family. I can see the growth and recognition elements of the number 3 in the numerology of the Empress as the third major arcana. I can recall that on her traditional, more traditional depiction, she has that crown of stars, which represents a union between inner and outer and higher and lower, earth and heaven, and how that connects her to a greater idea and a greater perspective of her situation. I can see the pomegranate on her traditional assignment there, which represents taking something small and unassuming and having a ton of potential within it. I'm able to see that and add that to my interpretation, as well as other things such as color, elements, astrological things. And with color too, you can work with color theory. You can work with traditional tarot correspondence colors. You can work with the chakras, if that's what you want to work with. Whatever color language works, that's there, but you have to learn it first and employ it, and not have it necessarily just be about what the card visually represents. So yes, like, there's a lot in a card, and there's more there when we do the little bit of homework to learn what some of these symbols are, and what some of these other people's thoughts are, and what these assignments of these cards are, and what those assignments mean. You don't have to necessarily practice that modality, but you can still use them. All of those details are details that flesh out the story we're telling. So reading intuitively is not just a viable way to read tarot. It's beautiful, it's powerful, it's personal, and it's basically impossible to do tarot well and really grow as a tarot reader unless you do it. That's true. If you want to be serious about tarot, you have to access your intuition at some point. But that intuition is not harmed by or impeded by or opposed to learning correspondences, learning what the decans of your cards are, learning what the Weightian or the Hermetic attributions and interpretations of these cards are, the numerology, the alchemy, the elements, the colors, what the little symbols are, what a pomegranate is, why is there a black cat on this card, what the hell is that bird? You know, there's always something to learn that means something, and it's part of a tradition. And these details are kind of like the lore of the setting that we've created with the cards when we do a reading. They're there in the background. They're not necessarily there to be in the focus, but knowing what they are, knowing how to employ them, knowing what they represent adds depth and meat to it. And in fact, it takes not only intuition it doesn't just add to the intuition, it takes intuition to determine which ones to focus on, which ones to employ. You don't want to employ every correspondence with every reading all the time. You want to make sure that they're context appropriate, and that takes intuition, so that you're not just rattling off a list of things that are true about a card. So it's impossible to separate correspondence from intuition. It's not about, doing tarot by the rules or doing it your own way, which is kind of what this divide focuses on. It's about painting this picture that we're creating with our tarot readings, using all the colors that are on our palette and using all the techniques we can to use those colors together in a harmonious way that makes sense. It's about creating a more organic picture and a more detailed picture. Emperor and Empress, we're going to come back to them numerologically together. When we combine them together, and this is another correspondence, we get another message that is available because you're aware of this correspondence. We get Chariot. So when we are really putting our heart into it and bringing our creativity to our tarot practice and our intuition to our tarot practice, and bringing our receptive, even you may say feminine energy to our tarot practice, but also bringing our more academic and our rigorous masculine energy to it, we have nowhere to go but forward, and nothing to do but take control and own our practice. And that's what that Chariot energy is. Bringing that 3 and 4 together creates direction. It creates control. It creates progress. And so when we don't have both, we sometimes don't progress as readers. And here's a metaphor for it too that I like. We can sing a beautiful melody with no words and have it move many people. But lyrics, man, they add so much more to the song, don't they? They make it relatable. They add depth. and nuance to it. You don't need to use lyrics, but when you do use the right lyrics, wow, that can make a song or break a song. So tarot's correspondences, they're just another form of lyrics. They're tarot's poetic vocabulary. And honestly, it's a vocabulary that's less abstract than its symbols, its visual symbols. Let's take a look at another card here for this example. Wheel of Fortune. Wow, this card is often really hard to read intuitively because what the hell is going on, right? Like, there's not a lot of story in this card, but there's a lot of symbols in this card. In terms of those symbols, they're a little bit crunchy, but just learning a little bit about them allows you to really like, oh, okay, well, what is a sphinx? What is that fox? What is that rabbit? What is Hermanubis? What are the four corners of it? What do those represent? If you know the four corners represent the start of the seasons, you can be like, oh, seasons pass. This is about progressing. This is about learning from mistakes, learning from our past. This is about moving forward. There's being a time and a place for everything. There's a lot that you can grow out of that narrative. And it's a pretty abstract card until we apply some of that. And so it's one of those cases where even just storytelling is made better by knowing a little bit about it. Now, it's not that intuitive reading is a bad way to start reading or a bad way to read in general or to identify as. You are intuitive. You can call yourself intuitive. But don't call yourself intuitive in a way that kind of implies that other people don't have or aren't using intuition, because almost everyone reading tarot in a dedicated way, as hobbyists, as professionals, as a spiritual practice, will be using it. We're not talking about, that asshole Janet from college who bought her first deck, opened the little book, read you to shit, and then said, well, that's what the book says, who really wasn't bringing anything to it personally. Actually, I think Janet was bringing a little something to it personally. She was telling you some stuff about her and about what she thinks about you. So maybe, maybe don't Facebook friend Janet when she finds you again online. I digress. My point was, most people are going to be using intuition anyway, regardless. It's just how it works. You can just use that, but you can add so much more to it with a little structure. So, I always tell new tarot students of mine and people who take my workshops to use their intuition first. You learn more by doing than by hearing, but that doesn't mean you still don't learn by hearing. I'd like to think we learn by hearing and by being told and being taught and being instructed and by following back on what other people have done first. Understand that what we learn by doing, that means that what we're learning from the information that's in books is where someone did before us and tracked it. And we can rely on what they did and avoid some of their mistakes. And we can make use of some of their insights. And we can draw upon their techniques and things like that in a way that really allows us to do greater than what they did, to bring our own take to it. And that's really amazing. And I think that when we throw that out, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So, you can always choose to not use a certain symbol set or a certain interpretation or system. If you don't like Aleister Crowley, don't use Hermetic interpretations. But I do recommend you try and learn a few, and as many as possible, really, ideally. And that way you can pick and choose what applies to what situation or what approach you want. Just because you're reading by the book doesn't mean you're not formulating your own style and that you won't formulate your own style and approach. The structure that emperor creates can still be your structure, but you just need to let him build a little bit first. Let Big Daddy help you, he wants to help, just like the Empress wants to help. He's not malicious. So I think you'll find by employing traditions, employing correspondences with any reading style will enrich it, but it'll especially enrich you as an intuitive reader. I don't use the identification so much because of the reasons I outlined, but I do primarily read by intuition. But that intuition is enriched by it. There's nothing that hurts my intuition by knowing some of this background information, by knowing these traditional assignments, by reading the book. And I think that as we educate ourselves, regardless of how we do it, we become more refined and articulate in our tarot style. And so that's why I think it's really important to do away with this division. It's not helpful. It's not really going to help any side grow. We all need to have both sides of that coin there to really have a full package. So when it comes to whether you're an intuitive reader or a formal reader. Don't dismiss someone for reading by the book because they happen to know which deacons are what. That took work for them, and someone had to innovate that and apply that. Tarot, most of Tarot's correspondences are not baked into it originally. They were synthesized into it and syncretized into it by others who did first, who intuited that fit and then made it theirs, and then we built upon it. So don't be afraid to build upon it. Don't be afraid to use those techniques. Intuitive reading can still have structure, and correspondences and education can be a big friend to that structure and to that intuitive process. You know, it's easier to sculpt. When we talk about sculpture, a lot of times sculptors will have a skeleton underneath it. Let correspondences be your skeleton. Let it be the wireframe you put your paper mache loveliness onto. Just whatever you do, make sure you're making your tarot practice work for you, and don't be afraid to grow with it. And don't be afraid to change and when it's not working, or when you would like it to be bigger and better. All right, and that's my hot take on intuitive reading and on correspondences. Hopefully you find my insights to be something that can get your mind going and get some of your thoughts and ideas coming forward, and maybe reevaluate your practice or incorporate something new into your practice. I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts on this. Please keep them civil is all I have to ask. In the comment section and on social media when I share this. And you'll hear another topical talk from me, another little essay like this probably next week. And that's all. You guys have a great time, great week this week. My name is Joshua with Fathoming Fish Tarot again. Like, subscribe, and follow. And you can find me at Fathoming Fish on Facebook, Fathoming Fish on Instagram. I will link those both in the comment section along with the decks that I used today. And finally, one last thought. There is a book I highly recommend for anyone who wants to help shore up on their correspondences without having to buy a lot of different books. Tarot Correspondences by Susan Chang, which I will also link in the description below. That's all, guys. Have a great day. Thank you very much, and like and subscribe if you feel so inclined.